So I alluded to in our last recording session that I would be starting a new role this week. And I've discovered something terrible about leading a large organization, namely how email works. And for context, I've been pretty much emailing, 5 to 10, maybe 15 people over the last couple of years. Obviously I'll email people outside of that circle, but the vast majority of my correspondence is to the same, very close knit circle of people in my work area. And now I'm working as the head of an organization that's 300 to 350 people, which
Mm-hmm.
means when I send out an email to all of these individuals, I will always get 20 to 30 out of office replies coming straight back to my inbox. What's more is frequently I will have 20 to 30 people wanting to comment on whatever I just sent to them. And
Oh,
unfortunately, I learned this the hard way after sending out 3 separate emails dealing with different issues to my group and having approximately 150 things I needed to file in my inbox yesterday. So, my takeaway is this. I mean, there are ways to work around this. There are rules, for instance, in Microsoft Outlook that allow you to automatically categorize all of the automatic replies. So you can just put them in a folder and forget about it. But my takeaway is the reason directors and managers get paid so much money is because they have to spend the majority of their day sorting through emails, replying to hundreds of emails,
yes,
and making sure
yes.
their inbox is clean so that they actually tackle all of the problems that they're dealing with. And I had never thought of it that way before, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Their primary job is not to lead an organization, it's to reply to everything that hits their inbox in an expedient manner.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I feel like every single time I get an email, though, on my UCSD email, it's about like stupid stuff, like a burglary in my neighborhood or something. And it's like 4 or 5 times a day.
Yeah, I guess you can categorize like pretty much any job into one of two. Is it a physical job, like when you're doing like some kind of labor, or is it a meetings job where you just have lots and lots of meetings and
Yes,
have to talk to
yes.
people in like Microsoft Teams groups on a daily basis? And unfortunately, I used to have a physical job when I worked in the restaurant industry and weighed about 60 pounds less than I do now. And now I have a meetings job where my job is primarily staring at a screen and going blind all day. And I gotta say, restaurant industry isn't great, but I'm kind of feeling like I want to go back to it for that reason alone.
Wow, okay. I mean, do what you want, but that's a big jump. I mean, there was
Anyways,
someone, hold on, there was someone that I knew recently that was talking about going from like a six-figure job back to working in coffee, like as a barista, because he just couldn't handle the stress of the six-figure job. He was like, it's too much. I loved what I did, but I just didn't want that amount of stress in my everyday life. So,
I wanted to take this opportunity on this podcast to announce that Joel Guy, will be stepping down as president of the United States. I will take no
oh,
further questions.
God. That's what a shame. I mean, why do you have to tell us on this platform? Why couldn't you just do it in the pressing room? Pressing room? Briefing room.
I actually get really
Post room?
embarrassed when a lot of people are staring at me and expecting me to like do important stuff. So it's just easier this way. All
Okay.
of our 15 listeners can, send us an email if they feel so strongly. It's a little easier to respond to
15
that audience.
is a stretch.
Wow, this intro's got to end at some point, right?
Our last intro was 5 minutes long, Joel.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Brevity is not one of our talents.
No, not at all.
And welcome back to Why Will No One Date These Guys, a podcast about sex dating and relationships and the culture that surrounds them and the media that influences our perceptions of how to conduct ourselves in emotional attachments to other people. My name's Joel
Joel,
Guy.
Joel, brevity is not your forte today.
Yeah, the reason no one will date us is because we can't shut up. Like, it's just nonstop
We are
gobbledygook coming out of our
yappers
mouths. We
through
are
and through.
yappers.
I am Naomi Guy. I'm co-yapper of this podcast.
Co-yapper. This is like bumper sticker potential. I'm not saying that we invented the term yap, but like this feels like it resonates with the other aesthetic, the other branding that we've established so far. I think it has
Definitely.
legs. So, Naomi, before we get back into Intimate Reflections Part 2, I do have a drink to try. It is another from the Aquagen brand, the Deep Ocean Sparkling Water, Taiwanese style. This time we're trying pineapple mango flavor. And for those that don't remember, this is a very interesting company that somehow infuses sparkling water with flavor and deep ocean mineral concentrate, which I assume is just like ground up dead fish. So,
Hot.
I think my face does look nicer than it was last time. All that collagen must be getting to me.
Ooh, okay. Go off, King.
Oh.
Tastes like dead
Ah.
fish. Ground up fish.
It doesn't taste like ground up fish. It's hard to describe. It's like pina colada flavor.
No.
It's like creamy
Stop.
water.
No.
I enjoy pina colada flavor when there's cream in something, but yeah, it's just like milky water, and not in like a milk tea way, in a just like watery cream way. And I don't even think there's any cream in here, which is baffling to me. I don't see any coconut or anything else that would imply it. Maybe it's like an artificial sugar or something. No, it appears to have just normal sugar. I don't have a good explanation, but this is not nearly as good as the last time. I don't think I'm going to allow my skin to get better. This is going to be the last time I engage with this brand.
This entire time you've been talking, I know you said it didn't taste like ground up fish, but this entire time I've been imagining it as milky water that tastes like ground up fish.
I can't stop you. Your brain is your brain, and I respect that. Naomi, we are back to discuss Intimate Reflections, Intimate Matters, Part 2. More additional anecdotes about early sexuality and ideas surrounding sexuality in America. I'm going to do something crazy this week, and I don't think we need to summarize it. If anyone is starting Part 2 without starting Part 1, you are missing out. Go check out Part 1. There is good information in there, and we're not going to dignify you by not summarizing it. Any thoughts before we jump back in?
Let's jump in.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how the modern understanding of sexuality in the past was not actually accurate, and how there's a lot of examples of how like the people in early America understood sex and sexuality and its importance in society and the family, in ways that like indicate they valued it a bit more than the modern era would imply. I'm jumbling a lot of words together, so I'm going to jump in, and hopefully this makes sense in just a second. So the chapter continues and says, whatever ambivalence colonists had towards premarital sexual relations, they agreed that husbands and wives ought to have sex. For New England Puritans, conjugal union was a duty. If unfulfilled, the neglected spouse might be tempted to commit adultery. So important was marital sex that a bride could leave a marriage if her husband proved to be impotent. At least one church excommunicated a husband because he denied conjugal relations to his wife for 2 years. Sexual attraction was valued within marriage only in moderation, however, and sexual intercourse as an act necessary to propagate the family. The Puritans admonished married couples not to allow their affections for one another to compete with their love of God. Mather warned of the inexpressible uncleanness in the married state, including inordinate infection. Michael Wigglesworth, God, these names. Wigglesworth decided to marry as a way of channeling his lusts, but then feared that his conjugal relations were excessive. Lord, forgive my intemperance in the use of marriage, he prayed. Some authorities believe that too frequent marital sex could be physically dangerous as well as impious, warning that satiety gluts the womb and renders it unfit for its office. So this is interesting because I think there's this modern perception that people back in the day lived in these kind of sexually repressed marriages, that women didn't have a lot of control over their autonomy, which is true, and that any enjoyment of sex was bad. And we've already discussed like how the last part isn't really true, but I think this reinforces that women actually had the discretion to leave their husbands in certain instances because of how important sex was in society. And that's not to say they were going around being like, oh yeah, have sex whenever you want with whoever you want. But like clearly society understood the importance of having sex and having a sexually fulfilling relationship, and did their best to encourage this behavior through the use of social mores and laws.
I'm the last person that should be judging other people about this, but Joel, is it conjugal or conjugal?
I'm probably mispronouncing that word. I'm
Because
cringing every time I pronounce it.
every time you said it, I just thought of juice for some reason.
The song Juice by Lizzo?
No.
Sorry, that's the only connection I can make between sex and the word juice. So, sexual complaints from both husbands and wives appeared in divorce cases heard in New England in the 18th century. Dissatisfaction did not necessarily result from physical disappointment, but rather when one partner believed that the other had stepped outside the bounds of the marital reproductive sexual system. The Puritan Benjamin Keene sought a divorce because of the insatiable desire and lust of his wife Sarah, whom he accused of adultery and of exposing him to the French pox or venereal disease. Abigail Bailey, mother of 10, filed for divorce after her husband not only had sexual relations with a servant, but also began to court their eldest daughter. The importance of maintaining marriage despite sexual conflicts is illustrated by the case of Stephen Temple's wife. Although she went to court to accuse her husband of sexually violating their 14-year-old daughter, Miss Temple did not seek a divorce. Rather, she wanted to force her husband to change his behavior. When he apologized and promised to reform, the couple reconciled. Whether sexuality was a source of comfort or conflict, married couples engaged in intercourse with the knowledge and hope it would lead to children. Among free white colonists, the availability of land and the need for laborers in the New World encouraged reproduction. There's kind of the societal pressure aspect here. They welcomed the birth of a child, and within most families had little reason to think about preventing conception. For Puritans, theological principles supported the emphasis on procreation, including the biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply, and the view that childbearing was women's calling. So important was reproduction to marriage that failure to participate in marital sexual relations could be grounds for divorce. A Plymouth wife testified in a 1686 divorce case that her husband was always unable to perform the art of generation. Her choice of a reproductive term, to describe male impotence, reflected the understanding that the duty to engage in marital relations meant the duty to procreate, and not simply to provide mutual comfort. For similar reasons, a woman who was past her childbearing years was less likely to gain a divorce on the grounds of her husband's impotence.
That's like so many stories about assault all in one little area, so I just need to like reflect on that, as well as the fact that it's literally like they were just making, like, you know how it's in the Latter-day Saints like religion, you're supposed to fruitfully multiply in order to for like the afterlife reasons. And I'm thinking about that. Joel, stop drinking that drink if it's gross. But I'm thinking about that in the sense where they're literally just creating servants for themselves. Like that's literally what they're doing. Is they're just having sex to make servants.
I guess. I mean, I think there was the understanding that eventually the kids would split off and like form their own families, either on different plots of land, on part of the land the father initially had. But I see your point. Yeah, it is an attempt to make life easier by having like extra hands around the house. Obviously, there are difficulties that come with that, like being able to provide food for everyone. But I don't know. I almost wonder if it's the, the book doesn't make this argument, but I don't feel this is an inaccurate argument. People have lustful urges, Naomi. I don't think people, 400 years ago would be any different than the people nowadays. And I have to wonder if they use the excuse of reproduction and expanding the workforce of society to justify having sex. And so you have, this example of the Reverend who is like, oh my God, my wife Sarah has too much insatiable desire and lust. And Sarah's over here like, no, 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 I have the perfect amount of lust, right? I just want to, have more kids and all that. And the Reverend is like, no, that's too evil and whatnot. But yeah, I can imagine a situation where like people genuinely aren't that interested in whether or not they have kids and more in just like I'm horny and I would like the excuse to be able to exercise my urges without having to worry about like social backlash and repercussions.
Horniness. Libido's a crazy thing.
Fair. I should note here that some women were very interested in having lots of sex and having kids. Obviously, because, they were going to court and trying to divorce their husbands over the fact that they were impotent. Other women, not so much. And I don't want to paint this picture that like everyone was aligned on this like idea that they had a duty to generate kids. The need to produce children, along with the risk that a child would not live to adulthood, required that married women endure repeated pregnancies. In addition to the risk of death in childbirth, which in some regions of the colonies accounted for as many as 20% of maternal deaths, the physical labors of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing preoccupied married women. For good reason, women feared childbirth, or in one woman's terms, the dreaded apparition. Mary Clapp, who bore 6 children and buried 4 before she died at the age of 24, recognized that bearing, tending, and bearing children was hard work. At the same time, however, most women assumed that childbearing was their natural calling. Mary Clapp believed it was the work she was made for and what God in his providence had called her to. After 6 childless years of marriage, the Puritan poet Anne Bradstreet expressed a longing for pregnancy. It pleased God, she wrote, to keep me a long time without a child, which was a great grief to me and cost me many prayers and tears before I obtained one. Bradstreet knew that lying in carried the possibility she would see not half my days that's due. She herself survived the births of 8 children, 7 of whom outlived her. Less fortunate was her daughter-in-law Mercy Bradstreet, who lost 3 infants and died herself after childbirth at the age of 28. After each of these deaths, Anne Bradstreet wrote not only of her grief, but also of her resignation to God's will. She consoled herself that the dead with thy Savior art in endless bliss. I should also note here that contraceptive methods, though mentioned previously, not super popular, were in fact used. Women commonly space pregnancies by breastfeeding their infants for a year, during which time many couples refrained from intercourse. Throughout the colonies, however, other means to impede conception or terminate pregnancy were rarely employed. Women turned to folk remedies and fertility medicines to encourage conception and avoid miscarriage rather than avoid pregnancy. Contraceptive practice, however, could lead to divorce, as in the case of Abigail Emery, who in 1710 complained that her husband practiced the abominable sin of onan, that is, withdrawing during sex, because he feared the charge of children. The Plymouth Pilgrims banished an adulterous minister, not only because he satisfied his lust on women, but because he did so while he endeavored to hinder conception. Cases of attempted abortion usually involved illicit lovers, not married couples. When a single woman, Margaret Lakes later confessed, she used means to destroy the fruit of her body to conceal her sin and shame. Elizabeth Robbins of Maryland confessed that she had twice taken Savin, an abortifacient. Her husband suspected that she had done so because she had an incestuous relationship with her brother. In contrast, married couples had little motive to prevent or terminate pregnancy.
You said one of those girls, I think that was Clapp, had 6 pregnancies by the time she was 24.
Yep. Mary Clapp, who bore 6 and buried 4 before she died at the age of 24.
My gosh, that's insane. I'm 24. No. Am I 24? I'm 23. I should be 5 deep right now.
Ugh. I mean, you could imagine, 1 or 2 of those were twins, but yeah, I would imagine, she probably got married at age 14 or something, and it was just nonstop baby making. Yeah, it's not a great time. And, this is one of those great examples when people are like, I wish we could harken back to simpler times where we lived on a farm and everyone had, a cow and some chickens and we raised corn and whatnot. And, I understand that they're not looking back to, Pilgrim era, but this is kind of the stuff you have to deal with when you're living off the grid, right? The modern version of living off the grid is living in a place that still has plumbing connected to a municipal line, and you typically are going to have access to the internet so you can post your tradwife videos. It's not the same as actually living off the grid and all of the problems that creates.
Joel, you just burned every single tradwife so hard right there.
That's been my whole goal this entire podcast. I have designed to destroy the biggest tradwife influencers. And I know among our 15 listeners, there's at least one person with the power to do just that. And I expect you to fulfill your obligation as someone who doesn't give us Patreon money and use your influence in other ways to benefit us in the long term. So we've talked a little bit about penalties for deviance in the previous chapter, and I want to dig in a little bit more because there's some interesting restrictions on how people are punished and what sort of acts incur punishment, and even what form those punishments can take. That is one example of a punishment. Now, Naomi, you won't believe this, but the gender of offenders shaped the treatment of deviants. Sodomy and rape were men's crimes. Although adultery, fornication, and bastardy involve couples, women in both northern and southern colonies were more likely than men to be prosecuted and convicted for these sexual offenses. The fact that pregnancy made a woman's participation in these acts apparent helps account for the disparity. In addition, Western culture had traditionally feared the sexual voraciousness of women. As the weaker vessel, women supposedly had less mastery over her passions and had to be carefully controlled. Penalties also differed. Men more often had to pay fines and court costs, while women who had less access to property had to accept whipping. Despite these distinctions, both women and men participated fully in the regulation of deviants. Both kept a close watch on neighbors and testified in court about illicit activities. Both faced fines, whipping, public humiliation, or execution. Both could repent and be reinstated in the community. For men and women, laws against extramarital sexuality carried harsh penalties. Even behaviors that might lead to sex outside marriage required punishment. The relatively minor offense of being a person of lewd life and conversation, God, I want that on a business card, person of lewd life and conversation, earned a fine of 50 pounds sterling in Virginia, while one man paid 20 pounds for profanely drinking and dancing with a married woman. In 1631, Massachusetts enacted the death penalty for adultery, a crime defined as sexual relations between a man and a married woman. Notice, that's not an unmarried woman and a married man, it's just man and a married woman. If you did see an instance where there's a married man and a single woman having sex, or between two single people having sex, that would have been fornication, not adultery. Most other colonies adopted the death penalty for adultery, though it was rarely enforced. After 1660, New England courts usually imposed fines of 10 to 20 pounds, along with public whipping or the wearing of the letters AD on a garment or burned into the forehead. In 1736, Thomas Clark of Dorchester, Massachusetts, had to choose between a 5-pound fine or 10 stripes with a whip for having, in a wanton and lascivious manner, the use and carnal knowledge of the body of Susanna, the wife of Joseph Brown, with her consent. Maryland law condemned adultery whether the man or woman were married. Southern courts often sentenced whipping and sometimes used the threat of banishment to punish adulterers. They might also require a bond of up to 100 pounds sterling to prevent an adulterous couple from seeing each other. Thoughts?
I mean, I'm not surprised by what you're telling me. Like, it's not surprising. That's all I have to say.
So, Naomi, typically witnesses were needed in order to convict adulterers in court. In Maryland, for example, several people witnessed John Neville having sexual relations with Susan Atchison, a married woman. They testified that they had seen her hand in his breeches and his in Susan's placket. Placket is a slit in the skirt. The court fined Neville and ordered Atchison whipped. That's weird. Well, last time a man has ever gotten out of, significant penalties in a court system. When Susanna Kennett and John Tolley of Virginia heard snoring in the next room, they stood on a hogshead of tobacco and peered over the wall to see that Richard Jones lay snoring in her placket and Mary West put her hand in his codpiece. Kennett then pried loose a board to observe Mary West with her coats up around her middle and Richard Jones with his breeches down lying upon her. In 1732, a New England woman testified to having looked in a hole at the end of the house where she saw her neighbor's wife and another man on the bed in the act of adultery. Similarly, a widowed lodger testified in the 1760s that he heard a man and woman discoursing in the chamber over the room, and he looked in to find the mistress of the house having sex with a male friend. In addition to testifying in court, neighbors zealously guarded moral standards in the community. The comments of two Massachusetts women who observed a man in the act of copulation attest to the sense of community responsibility for regulating morality. Interrupting the act, the women asked if he was not ashamed to act so when he had a wife at home. An incident in Maryland further suggests how even in a less settled area, the community could mobilize against adulterers. Several travelers lodged overnight at the residence of Captain Fleet, who became very angry when he realized that one lodger, Mr. Carleen, was committing adultery on the premises. Fleet had the couple turned out of doors. The court subsequently banished Carleen for disowning his wife. When he tried to return home, Carleen's neighbors would not allow him to show his face. Finally, in the fishing village of Marblehead, Massachusetts, neighbors wielding clubs attacked the home of William Beale, whose wife Martha was suspect for having a previous marriage annulled and an intimate relationship with a servant. "Come out, you cuckoldry cur," they called to William. "We are come to beat thee. Thou livest in adultery."
I just can't believe how many people are willing to say, like, oh yeah, I looked in on my neighbor, like, having sex. Like,
I mean, no, I think you're right. It's two things. I think there's definitely the religious element where you probably felt a moral obligation to be like constantly observing the people around you and like upholding moral norms. Um, it's similar to how like a lot of Christians are like, well, I'm not going to like discriminate against gay people, but I don't want them living in sin. And they try to like regulate how gay people act. And they're like, oh, well, they can't do pride parades, right? That's just like sexual deviance. I mean, I'm okay with gay people, but they can't express themselves how they want. Can you imagine? That'd be crazy. But I think the second thing is, and this is like a really important thing, Naomi, they didn't have TV back then. They didn't have
oh,
radio.
such a
They,
good point.
they
Oh my
didn't have
god.
books. I mean, if they had
Yeah.
music, it would be like a broken banjo that was poorly tuned, or it'd be
Oh my
like
god.
vocal singing, right? Like their major source of like literature would be the Bible in a lot of these areas, right? They're bored. They have very little to do. What are they going to do? Like play hopscotch? And keep in mind, gossip is a lot harder when it's the same like 20 people interacting day after day. It's much easier when you like are in a big city and there's someone outside your social circle who interacts with people outside your social circle who then comes back every so often and is like, "So Mary, did you hear?" Right? Like all this stuff I think leads to situations where like this is going to be a lot more common. People are just bored. They hear something, or they're looking for something, and they peek in on a house, and they're like, I see something going on here. Let me spend a few minutes peeping through this hole before I jump to any conclusions."
No, I think that's a really good point. If I didn't have Netflix, currently I'm watching Dexter, by the way. Good show. You should watch it. If I didn't have that, I definitely just have a cup up to the fucking wall that I share with my neighbors. Never met them, but I'll figure out a lot about them that way.
Yeah, and I guess the one other thing that's relevant here is like both houses were poorly constructed, so there were gaps in the walls, but also like they weren't insulated that well. So like it's much easier to hear if there's, some moaning or like some lewd language being used if you live in like a town and like there's someone's house 20 feet away. I would imagine, the circumstances just make it easier to regulate behavior. And because of that, these standards about regulating behavior become a lot more common. Now, here's something that's interesting that I didn't really understand until I read this book, and I am a little fascinated by gay behavior. Because they so clearly defied the norm of reproductive sexuality, the crimes of sodomy, buggery, and bestiality carried the death penalty. As the founder of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, explained in the case of William Plain, who was executed for sodomy and corrupting youths by masturbation, these acts were dreadful because they tended to the frustrating of the ordinance of marriage and the hindering of the generation of mankind. The narrow legal definition of sodomy, which required proof of penetration, along with the requirements of 2 witnesses for capital punishment, limited the application of the death penalty. At least 5 men were executed for sodomy or buggery during the 17th century, one by the Spanish in Florida, one in Virginia, one in New Haven, and 2 in New York. No one was executed for sodomy in the 18th century. But men convicted of sodomitical acts, such as spending their seed upon each other, received severe and repeated whipping, burning with a hot iron, or banishment. As in other cases, the higher the status of the accused, the less likely was severe punishment. Despite his 30-year history of attempted sodomy with servants and neighbors, the wealthy Nicholas Cinchen of Connecticut merely had his estate held as bond to ensure his future good behavior.
I don't like the term spending their seed on each other.
That's
I
your
don't like it.
problem?
That's my problem.
I don't like the burning with hot irons, but you do you, I guess.
Burning with hot iron. Is that a sexual thing?
No, it's a punishment. You heat up an
Yeah,
iron
that's what I
bar and
thought. So that's like pretty
yeah,
normal. Yeah, okay.
that feels painful, right?
Yeah.
If you hit a hot stove, it hurts, but you have the ability to pull your hand away. Imagine if someone
No.
is like, yeah, superheating your skin. Not a fan.
No, I understand that, but that's a lot more normalized of a phrase than spending your seed. Ugh.
What can this get me at the market today?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I think about. Like, ew.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing that fascinates me, and that is the crime of sodomy was not equivalent to the modern idea of homosexuality. Sodomy referred to unnatural, that is, non procreative sexual acts, which could be performed between two men, a man and an animal, technically considered buggery or bestiality, or between a man and a woman. When a Maryland woman sued her husband for divorce, charging he had committed diverse inhumane usages and beastly crimes, she could have meant anal intercourse in marriage or with another man. Although the term sodomy was not applied in sexual relations between women, one colony, New Haven, listed among its capital offenses women's acts against nature. The few surviving cases that refer to lewd behavior between women record punishments of whipping or admonishments rather than execution. In 1642, for example, a Massachusetts court severely whipped a servant and fined her for unseemly practices betwixt her and another maid. Unlike many Native American tribes, in which the male Burdaki, I guess gay person, might live as a woman, or maybe trans person, might live as a woman and marry a man, colonial society had no permanent cultural category for those who engaged in sexual relations with members of their own gender. Like other sinners, women or men who were punished for unnatural sexual acts did not acquire a lifetime identity as homosexuals, and they could be reintegrated into the fold. In 1732, for example, Ebenezer Knight of Marblehead confessed and repented a long series of uncleanness with mankind. His church suspended Knight, but after he returned from a 6-year sojourn in Boston, the congregation reinstated him. So I find that interesting, because if you contrast that to the Straight State book that we just read, regulation of homosexuality in America was done because of concerns of like unnatural perversion inherent to people who practiced gay sex. And there were concerns, for instance, during the Great Depression, that gay hobos would corrupt other people around them and that they were like just permanently scarred deviants who couldn't be integrated back into normal society. So at some point, and I haven't still figured out, when this changeover occurs, society moves from having gay sex is bad but doesn't permanently like mark you as different than society to having gay sex makes you abnormal and inherently a danger to people around you. That's quite the changeover. And it's fascinating that this time doing something like this was not the end of like your life.
Well, we kind of have that stigmatization today as well. Like it's like you against individuals that are unhoused is like, oh, obviously all of them, are unclean and they're addicts and they like are sexually devious for the
I should
reason
note,
of.
listeners, these are Naomi's opinions. They're not like it's just coming straight from Naomi's head. I don't know where she got them.
No, but you understand what I'm saying. Like we
Yeah,
still
yeah,
have
no,
those like
that's a good
ideas today.
comparison.
So
Yeah,
it's interesting that we're still dealing with the aftermath of that. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. Like comparing our unhoused population, obviously, to the United States sucks and everything, but like our unhoused population to other countries' unhoused populations. So I'm gonna blame this all on Reagan, and we can move on.
um, I mean, the Great Depression was a little bit before Ronald Reagan was president,
I'm
but
I'm
I
I'm
see your
not.
point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool. Blame it all on Reagan. Oh, another good bumper sticker. Blame it all on Reagan.
Great. This is a perfect podcast, Naomi. We are coming up with all sorts of ideas to monetize our brand. And that's the most important thing we do here, right? It's not educating the public. It's,
No, not at all.
getting those sweet, sweet Benjamin Franklins.
Yeah.
I almost wonder, and this is like my own theory, but would seem to logically stem from a lot of what we've discussed, if the crime of like having sex with other men wasn't considered so bad because of potential frequency of gay sex. And I say that with the context that like I recognize all of society was telling people that like they should be, saving themselves for marriage and doing sex only for reproduction. But like, obviously, there were things such as bestiality, where people would go have sex with farm animals. And I wonder if in a similar way, you would have examples of like teen boys experimenting with one another. Not even, because they were sexually attracted to one another, but because, again, people get horny. And right, a good way of like relieving your sexual urges is doing so with another person. And so I would imagine that like, even if you had not personally engaged in that kind of behavior, you were probably aware that like other people in your community had done something like that. And so while bad, it wouldn't seem to be as like inherently evil as other sexual acts. Just a theory, but it would track with kind of the narrative that's been presented so far.
No, that tracks. I could go along with that.
So we're going to jump ahead a bit to the 1700s. We've been dancing a little bit back and forth in history here, but we're going to discuss kind of a cultural change that came later down the road. So new concepts within religion and politics also affected sexuality during this era. Beginning in the 1740s, the religious revival known as the Great Awakening encouraged individuals to take responsibility for their own actions, and state regulation of morality diminished. After the Revolutionary War, the gradual disestablishment of the Protestant churches further weakened the bond between state and church, and consequently, the moral authority of the churches. Finally, at a time when the pursuit of happiness became a political ideal, individual pleasure, and not simply the duty to procreate or to give comfort to one's spouse, came to be valued as the goal of sexual relations. A brief glance at European intellectual and social history provides an important context for sexual change in the American colonies and the new nation. In Europe, Enlightenment ideas about the relationship of the individual to society, along with the decline of the traditional patriarchal family, encouraged new sexual beliefs. In the 17th century, English Puritans had been suspicious of bodily pleasure and associated sensuality with the biblical fall from grace. Strict community control was therefore necessary to prevent the sins of the flesh from undermining the godliness of a community. In contrast, Enlightenment writers of the 18th century elevated all that was related to nature, including sexuality, as good and desirable. Influenced by an intellectual climate that emphasized the pursuit of individual happiness, many European writers stressed that sexual relations provided a healthy means to this ideal. One logical extreme of this position was the practice of sexual libertinism, or the pursuit of pure pleasure unbounded by social responsibilities. Only a small group of elite males could emulate this ideal, such as the rakes and seducers who shared their stories of sexual exploits in the London coffee houses of the late 18th century. For others, nonetheless, the introduction of personal pleasure as a goal placed a new, more positive value upon sexuality. In America, for example, Benjamin Franklin, who had been exposed to European ideas, referred to sexual intercourse as a virtuous action. I want that on the $100 bill. I want like Ben Franklin giving like the thumbs up, and he's got like a smirk on his face, and it's just like, sex is a virtuous action.
I want him like winking and saying that, like
maybe he has like his arm around like a comely woman who has like a tight fitting, a chest piece, and he's like making out with her, but also like looking at the viewer. He's like,
ooh,
yeah,
maybe like that. A butt grab or something in there too.
He's riding a surfboard, right? Or he's riding a surfboard, and there's like a big marijuana leaf behind him. Okay?
No.
And he's like playing a double neck guitar.
Joel, he's obviously riding a horse and holding the American flag in his other hand.
Right. Okay, this is good. Naomi, this is like the new version of all of those like stoner shops that sell a million variations of Marilyn Monroe with like gangster tattoos, and she's like topless and she's like covering her like boobs and smoking like a blunt or something. Right? We need to bring back like Revolutionary War intellectual iconography and like co-opt it and be like, no, the real cool people were like these guys with their powdered wigs and they're like breeches that you can reach into if you're having a good time. we got some good ideas out of this.
If you want to spread your seed.
I don't like that. Spend your seed, Naomi.
Sorry, spend it.
It should also be noted that at the same time, new scientific accounts of the functioning of the human reproductive system recontextualize sexuality as something distinct from procreation. As European scientists learned about the role of the sperm and egg in creating an embryo, they helped to undermine the older belief that pleasure was a precondition to conception and made possible the separation of sexual intercourse as an act and reproduction as a goal. Significantly, the new medical literature attached special cultural meanings to the physiological differences between men and women. Elaborate metaphors of the active male sperm and the passive female egg employed scientific knowledge to transform sexual values. Just as Enlightenment views about individual happiness applied primarily to men, so too did medical ideas increasingly differentiate by gender, encouraging men, but not women, to seek sexual pleasure. Indeed, a new ideal of female passionlessness emerged in Anglo-American culture in the late 18th century, and biological arguments supported its contention that women had desires that were more maternal than sexual. Do you have desires that are more maternal than sexual?
I don't know, that's like really Freudian and I don't like it. I don't know. That just makes me uncomfortable. Like even like
me is
mixing those two things like is just gross to me. Like as like you can either be maternal or sexual. You can't be both.
I guess, yeah. What baffles me is like these same ideas are still kind of popular today, right? This is a lot of like right-wing gobbledygook, which is like, men are the hunters, men are the pursuers, women just need to sit back and let men come to them and accept every advance that they get. And it's like just a basic knowledge of systems theory would help people understand that a part of the system does not represent the system, right? Just because we're made out of blood cells doesn't mean we act like blood cells, right? There's this thing called emergent behavior where lots of different systems work together and create like additional properties that allow people to be more than the sum of their parts. And so it's so funny to me. This is like an ancient Greek idea of like how the world works. It's like, well, the egg just sits there and the sperm, it's going for it, right? Therefore, men are the pursuers and women just are the mommies. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? This is what you come up with when you're you're lying down on an elaborate couch eating grapes, or a servant girl is feeding them to you, and you're drinking wine with your homies, and you're like intellectualizing about the existence of the world. It's the same idea that would like bring the ancient Greeks to be like, well, fire is warm and humans are warm, therefore humans are made out of fire. It's like, what the hell are you on about, dude? This isn't science. This isn't anything. It's just gobbledygook.
I don't know, I'm just stuck on the fact that you just keep saying gobbledygook. But again, that great picture of the intellectual, quote unquote, that's lying down and getting served grapes, that'd be another great way to visualize Benjamin Franklin on the $100 bill.
Lying down, there's like the US like Washington Monument in the background. He's just like on the Lincoln Memorial, just like reclined. He's like throwing up a peace sign or something. He maybe like has a what's the name for the shirt? It's not wife beater, that's offensive. Like the white tank top.
A-line shirt.
Sure, an A-line shirt, and you can see like chest hair like poking out over the top, and he has just like a big jug of something with like 3 X's on it, but it's actually wine. Oh, this is beautiful. This is what AI was created for. I hate AI generated art, but like there's certain applications where I'm like, no human being, no real artist would feel comfortable depicting the ideas that I've come up with. I'm going to be the machine to bring my vision to life.
I'm just imagining you're walking along like Venice Beach or something, and you're like going up to all these street artists. You're like, please, man, please just do this for me. And they're like, sorry, like I don't feel comfortable doing that. And then you just go home. You're in a dark room, sitting in the corner, and your laptops. You're like, AI, please do this for me.
I'm picturing that. I've seen this phrase used over and over again where conservatives now are like, we're the new counterculture. All these people are like out partying and being hedonists, and like the real thing you got to do if you want to stand out from the crowd is embrace tradition. And so you have these shops that are just like Trump merchandise, and they sell nothing but like Trump campaign merchandise. And then they start selling these like Marilyn Monroe inspired shirts that have like George Washington like posed with 2 AK-47s and Benjamin Franklin like slapping Ivanka's butt or something. And I don't know if there's like another major chain, maybe Cracker Barrel, that would sell this sort of stuff. Um, but I want to see it. I want to see it, Naomi. This is what I was put on Earth to do.
I
If I don't
speaking
swallow
of
my
crack
tongue.
speaking of Cracker Barrel, we I live with two other people, so there's three of us in this apartment, and
That's how math works. Yeah.
yeah, that's how math works. And so we bought three rocking chairs for our patio, and so now it just looks like Cracker Barrel.
Except you don't racially discriminate against minorities. So I should note something here. This is not something that was brought up in the book Intimate Matters. It's kind of my own knowledge about the world that I pulled from The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber. So David Graeber, I believe I've brought up on this podcast before. He's the writer of such books as Bullshit Jobs and Debt the First 5,000 Years. And I would strongly recommend, before you read either of those, to check out The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. And basically, he and his anthropologist friend, David Wingrove, go through a lot of these fundamental assumptions about the development of cultures and how that's influenced like civilization, and are like, basically everything we thought about like anthropology and archaeology in the 1950s is wrong, and we have like hard-hitting evidence that supports a lot of these assertions. One good example that really stuck out to me is his argument that European ideas about Enlightenment came, at least partially, from Native Americans. The argument they make is actually pretty compelling, because, you know, a lot of people want to say, oh, well, like Native Americans don't really have like cultural output, and that's just like fundamentally wrong. He cites several examples of prominent Native Americans at the time who learned English, who learned about Europe, who learned about Christianity, and then wrote extensive philosophical discourses about how messed up Europe was. And so they would say, you know, hey, you know, we heard from you about like how great God is. Why is it you've created this civilization where there's so much suffering? You know, in our communities, everyone's looked out for, right? We're not like punishing anybody. We're not forcing them to be poor. We work together as a unit, and yet you have like homeless people all over in your streets. We believe in the fundamental value of human beings, and that's why we treat men and women effectively the same. You're over here and you have these like incredibly rigid gender roles, and you seem to believe that this is a better way of running things. And so there was one guy, I forget his name, it was like Condoronderock or something, but he was known as the Muskrat by the French, because that's effectively what his name translates to. And he wrote a series of treatises that were absorbed by European intellectuals, and then sparked a lot of the great debates about the importance of politics and monarchies and how society should be structured. And obviously they would do this because Native Americans practiced a way of life that was so distinct from what Europeans had done traditionally, right? The only other contrast they kind of have is Asia and India, which were not, you know, as explored and not as, you know, intimately connected as they are, you know, kind of today. And, you know, those systems also were set up with like monarchies. Those systems were also set up with like rigid hierarchies of governance. So the Europeans encounter criticisms of how they've set up society coming from outside observers who actually practice these things, i.e. the Native Americans, and they take that seriously. They say, yeah, why is it we have kings? Why is it we expect that like society should be set up in this way? And that sparks a lot of the conversations about the Enlightenment. Now, I'm going to cut it short here because there's a lot more detail I can go into. Again, I would strongly urge people to go read this book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. But I want to tie that back into this, because during the 17th century, as Intimate Matters is talking about, there are these new ideas about sexuality and the role of pleasure. Well, where are these ideas coming from? Where do you think people are getting all of these insights?
Oh,
I'm not
okay.
saying that's like the only source, because like
Yeah.
obviously there's like new forms of science that are unveiling, you know, the mysteries of like reproduction. But simultaneously, we already talked in part one about how Europeans were encountering native peoples, and the women were walking around topless, and some people who were born biologically male were living life as female, and there were women who could divorce their husbands. There's all of these things that are different from European sexuality and reproduction and gender norms. Of course they're going to be discussing this. Of course they're going to be considering this, and that's going to be influencing their thought. So I'm not going to blame this book, which was written in 1988, long before the dawn of everything came out, but I think it's an important lesson to take away that, like, these ideas do not come from nothing. Typically, there's a spark that, builds into something greater. And if the Native Americans did something, Europeans bring those, like, crazy stories back to their people. Those people then turn it into intellectual discourse, and then that gets passed back to America. It's a never-ending cycle.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. You just shattered a couple things for me in my head, but we'll move on.
Okay. Two other things should be noted. Similarly, this ideological reconstruction of sexuality coincidentally, with the ideological reconstruction of sexuality came subtle shifts in English family life. By the late 18th century, the ideal of effective relationships within the family had become more widespread. Most couples now recognize the mutual rights and obligations of spouses included emotional and sexual pleasure. At the same time, though, lust and love remained suspect as motives for marriage. Young people could increasingly choose their own mates, regardless of parental opinion. Gradually, love was becoming a respectable basis for marriage choice, encouraging a new view of marriage in which the affections of husband and wife were as important as their economic and reproductive obligations to one another. Further evidence from English history suggests that individual choice played a larger role in sexual life during this period. After a long period of relatively low premarital pregnancy rates, the incidence of early births nearly doubled in 18th century England. Illegitimacy rates rose even more sharply, from under 1% of all births in the early 17th century to 6% in the 1780s. Together, these figures suggest a breakdown in traditional sexual restraints during courtship and a decline in the pattern of premarital intercourse followed by marriage. A hint of the loosening of the tie between reproduction, sexuality, and marriage appeared in the century after 1675, when members of the British upper classes began to practice contraception. As survival rates for children improved, women could bear fewer children. When this happened, sexual relations within marriage might increasingly serve other than reproductive purposes. In short, in 18th century England, the source for most American immigrants and ideas, science, social thought, and family life all reflected a belief in more freedom of individual choices in sexual relations.
Okay. See, this is all very interesting because I'm like, obviously the shows that I watch that are like period pieces like aren't very accurate, but I'm like comparing it to that and it's like really funny. So that's all.
Yeah. And I think you can understand the greater focus on the individual if you think about the breakdown of like societal constructions during this era, right? When people start saying, well, why do we have a king? Then you start asking, well, why do we have a mayor? And then you start asking, well, why is my dad telling me how to rule all of my life, right? Like, I'm not saying this was true in all instances, but like definitely a lot of people would be influenced if power bases that were always seen as legitimate suddenly start crumbling. You're going to ask yourself some questions, right? About how you structured your life and like the things that you deem important. And so I think you really can't unconnect people's ideas about sexuality from the societal pressures that are happening during this point, right? As society reshapes, so will people's understanding of their individual role within it. And that, of course, is going to influence how they reproduce and how they choose to find partners.
No, I totally agree. I think I'm still stuck on what you were just talking about, the indigenous peoples and how they affected the Enlightenment. So now I'm thinking, like, what other things that we've obviously the white people take credit for everything, but like
Yeah.
what else have we taken um credit for that isn't actually our ideas in this sense? Like, I think of like sexual history as like, um very private, and so reading, like having you like tell me about this book, it's like interesting that you're kind of enlightening me in this way about things of this nature. So I had no idea. I had no idea because like, we always focus on white people history. We never focus on indigenous history.
I should note here that during this period, there was a greater focus on physical attractiveness. A new emphasis on the physical attractiveness of women accompanied the introduction of sentimental language and sexual references in courtship. According to Laurel Ulrich, the female ideal shifted from one of meekness and spirituality to one of beauty and sexual appeal. After the 1730s, she has noted, American portraiture began to idealize the young, full-bossomed, small-waisted, and raven-haired woman as opposed to the practical helpmeet of an earlier generation. Both language and art thus pointed the way towards new criteria for selection of mates based on personal taste and emotions rather than practical and familial concerns. Sons and daughters not only chose mates with less attention to property and family considerations, but some people, Naomi, even disregarded parental opinion altogether.
What?
Yes, thank you for that reaction. Operating within a political climate that decried tyranny and exalted the rights of the individual, some children married over parental objections while others failed to inform their parents at all. In 1760, William Byrd III told his wife of his wedding after the fact. "Good God," she cried out, "is my son married and never acquainted me with it?" Other parents reacted more calmly to the new style of individual choice. As one father explained in 1757, all marriages ought to be entirely from the choice of each party. More often, however, parents and children who lived during this transitional period were likely to be in conflict over the relative roles of the family and the individual in choosing the marriage partner.
I didn't realize it was that early on. I thought it came much later.
Yeah, and I think, one of the difficulties is like establishing like time period boundaries, right? Like you're going to see, some people adopting it and then like that trickles down and more people become aware of it and like this becomes a bigger phenomenon. So it's hard to like put your finger on like when the trend actually began, probably because like many people who started this, their parents would be so ashamed of them they would like never mention it. And then like over time, as that begins to trickle out, it becomes more normal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I agree with you. I thought this came a bit later with like industrialization, but it's fascinating nonetheless.
Definitely, yeah.
So how does this impact the community regulation of sexual deviance, Naomi? Seriously, is the answer I'm looking for. The regulation of deviance was also changing, especially where heterogeneous towns replaced small rural settlements, and where the goal of commercial success supplanted that of salvation. Social stratification contributed to the problem. In cities such as Boston and Philadelphia, it was difficult to scrutinize the private lives of a small but troubling underclass of transients. Moreover, with the post-revolutionary disestablishment of the churches, state regulation of morality declined noticeably. Legislatures and courts had once responded to the clergy's jeremiads, I don't know what that is, demands maybe, the clergy's demands about moral laxity by passing and enforcing laws that punish sexual relations outside of marriage. Now, however, courts less frequently enforced moral laws and showed more concern about the economic implications of illicit sexual activity. Responses to illegitimacy, fornication, and rape illustrate these changes. In the 17th century, laws against bastardy had been couched in terms of the punishment of sin and the protection of the family. During the 18th century, however, bastardy came to be treated more as an economic than a moral problem. Classic America, always treating things as economic rather than moral problems. According to Robert Wells, governments in the American colonies gradually lost interest in prosecuting sexual sinners so long as the children of sin were financially cared for. Similarly, the state less frequently prosecuted fornication and rape. In Virginia, for example, the number of morals cases heard in the courts peaked in the 1720s and then declined sharply in New England after 1775. Oh, I'm sorry. In Virginia, for example, the number of morals cases heard in the courts peaked in the 1720s and then declined sharply. In New England, after 1775, courts convicted fewer attempted rapists than in the past, and they tended to convict for the lesser charge of assault rather than rape. Indictments for infanticide decreased as well, and after 1775, infanticide laws were relaxed to provide proof of live birth for a conviction. Thus, with the formation of state and local governments during and after the Revolution, and the gradual separation of church from civil authority, a process that extended to the 1830s, the prosecution of sexual offenses lost the central place it had held in earlier colonial society. And you know why, Naomi? Because they had books. They had books to read, rather than peeking in their neighbors' holes in the walls.
I thought you were going to stop at neighbors' holes. They just peek in neighbors' holes.
Fair. So there is one last thing that I want to end on today, and that is the decline of kind of church regulation. Obviously, the churches have less influence, but even within the churches, there is less of a focus on like punishing deviance. And this leads to a social problem of sorts. Even in the churches, moral regulation no longer took the same form. In the 17th century, all sex outside marriage was subject to action as fornication. In the 18th century, however, churches continued to punish adultery, but not necessarily all fornication between single men and women. In addition, the rituals of confession and readmission to the community of the godly had less meaning for those who lived in the late 18th century. By the 1790s, the public confession of sin was being replaced by written confessions. Many communities abolished their church courts entirely. With the loss of community involvement in the moral affairs of individuals, it was left to the family to regulate the morality of its own members. Eventually, the individual would be expected to act on internalized rather than externally enforced sexual controls. The more frequent appearance of prostitutes in 18th century American cities attests to the breakdown of community regulation and morality. In the 17th century, seaport towns such as Boston and New Amsterdam had some prostitutes in their midst. Boston courts charged Alice Thomas with allowing men and women the opportunity to commit carnal wickedness, and a 1673 Massachusetts law prescribed whipping and hard labor for a bawd, a whore, or a vile person. I don't know what a bawd is. B-A-U-D. Maybe body, like just an individual who is.
I
Sure,
think it's just a
we'll keep
whore.
going.
I think it's just a
A
whore.
whole
Whore.
damn Naomi. The public sale of sexual services remained quite limited, however. In 1720, William Byrd failed in his attempt to find a prostitute in Williamsburg, Virginia. The residents of Massachusetts had so little concern about prostitution that Cotton Mather was unable to mobilize support for his proposed Society for the Suppression of Disorders, modeled on English organizations that opposed brothels. By the 1750s, however, the growth of maritime trade, the transiency of urban life, and the social dislocations of the French and Indian Wars encouraged prostitution. When soldiers congregated in cities such as Boston and New York, female camp followers soon arrived to minister to the needs of the men. Women provided food or washed clothing, and some sold their bodies. Widowed or impoverished women who worked in the cities after the war might take to walking in the streets or working in the bawdy houses that appeared in Boston, Philadelphia, Newport, and Charleston. In addition to streetwalkers, some women, such as Hannah Diley of Boston, operated from their homes. In 1753, at the age of 60, this artisan's wife was convicted of using her home for lechery fornication. She permitted persons not of good behavior and fame to carnally lie with whores, which they said Hannah then and there procured for them. Although waterfront areas where transients, vagrants, and prostitutes intermingled with sailors, servants, and slaves, taverns often served as fronts for disorderly houses. Areas such as Philadelphia's Helltown were considered little better than nurseries of vice and debauchery. In other districts, travelers might encounter prostitutes at the local tavern, an institution decried by John Adams for extinguishing virtuous love and changing it into filthiness and brutal debauch. By the end of the century, New York City brothels rented rooms to both white and black women who brought customers there, while laborers, sailors, prostitutes, and runaway wives drank together in bawdy houses where dancing, kissing, cursing, and swearing took place nightly. For the first time, urban men could easily locate prostitutes if they tried. Benjamin Franklin claimed that women walking the streets would expose themselves to sale at the highest bidder. As a young man traveling by boat to New York, Franklin himself was approached by two young women who turned out to be a couple of strumpets. His fear that frequent intrigues with low women might have endangered his health implied that Franklin took advantage of these opportunities. For other men, the resurgence of camp following outside of the Revolutionary War exposed them to opportunities for illicit sex. So this leads to some moral panics. There are examples that the authors cite about like mobs burning down brothels and stripping women, carrying them through the streets and all that jazz. But you can see how changes in city structure and again, social pressures radically alter how communities operate and thus how sexuality is regulated, right? At the point where everyone lives in kind of these small intimate villages where they know each other, it's much harder to operate a house of ill repute, you know what I mean? It's harder to operate a brothel when everyone knows each other. First, who's going to work for you? Second, everyone's going to know it was you. Much easier when you have a bunch of transients coming in and out of your city due to wartime activities, and that you don't have this tight-knit familial social structure governing all of your actions. So that's a really, really big change in how sexuality is governed, because suddenly you go from this period where the only options for young men seeking sex are by themselves with other men or with animals to, there's opportunities to engage with women inside these cities for, I would imagine, relatively low cost. And of course, this is a period during industrialization where more people are probably going to have access to additional money in a way you probably didn't when you were living on a farm all by yourself. And so the opportunities for, quote unquote deviant behavior just expand dramatically during this period. It's a huge change, huge repercussions on how we think about and conduct ourselves in terms of sexuality. And I am so excited I'm reading this book.
I think it's interesting, like, comparing the straight state to this book because, like, I don't know. I just hearing about like the sexual deviants that are those that are transients, um, and then hearing about like how transients like shaped sexual history in this book is very interesting. So I don't know. Like they gave the straight state kind of gave like the transients a bad sort of connotation, but in this book, we're talking more about how they kind of reshaped the idea of not sexuality, but the idea of sexual encounters. I also found it interesting that both minority women and white women were both serving men in the same brothels, because I guess I've never thought about that before, but I had assumed that that was something that, wasn't heard of because of the amount of racial discrimination that we've seen throughout in the entire United States history.
Yeah, I'm going to imagine that was probably more of an exception than the rule. The authors don't really go into much detail here. Obviously, in cities where you have free persons living, I imagine there was more racial integration and kind of acceptance. I imagine in like the South, that was probably not a particularly common thing to occur. That said, I'm getting ahead of myself, but there is a conversation in this book about interactions with Spanish speakers and kind of the settling of the southwestern United States. And one of the things that's established from the beginning is that white people are very open and willing to marry Spanish women or Native American women living in those areas. And I guess you could argue that's like partially due to there just being like no other white women around, right? The number of white women traveling to these areas was very low for the longest period of time. But I think it also is like an example of white people being a minority in an area that's like majority Spanish, majority Native, and kind of just like accepting their place and like changing how their social mores operate to accommodate that. So yeah, like I think social pressure, social stigma laws would probably heavily regulate, how much interaction a white person could have with, a black woman at the time. Though it's also possible that like they had these brothels where it was expected that white people have sex with white people, black people have sex with black people, and that's how they conducted themselves. I don't know, like I'm sure there's a fascinating history of how prostitution was practiced in the United States that we could get into. That said, we've moved away from the horny phase of our podcast, so maybe that's a conversation for another time.
What a time to be alive. Well, I appreciated this second part. How many more parts do we have left before the end of the book?
Um, you know, so this book is about 400 pages. I'm going to say something that's going to scare you, and I don't want you to get freaked out. We have not gotten through more than about 100 pages.
God, I love when you're like, oh, this is only going to be 3 parts, and I'm like, no, this is going to be 5 to 6.
No, that said, I have many fewer notes in the the last 3/4 of the book. It's interesting. There's lots of really fascinating anecdotes. The problem is it's a lot of stuff we've discussed already. So, like, the first part that deals with, like, early American history, I think is, like, the most fascinating, most interesting, most introspective, and that I learned a lot from. And while I would recommend the whole book, I gotta say, like, the last 3/4 are just not as novel to me. And so we're going to be skipping through American history a bit faster once we get into part 3.
Okay, sounds good. Well, listeners, we appreciate you coming and listening to us yet another episode. As mentioned before, we do have a Patreon. The Patreon benefits 2 major causes right now, the Palestinian genocide that's going on, as well as the trans genocide scene in the United
Stop
States.
saying that, Naomi. It's not benefiting the genocide. It's fighting against that.
Have I said that before?
It's such a weird way of wording it. You always word it where it's like, we support the genocide of Palestinians. And it's like, no, no, no. We are fighting against
I'm
that
cutting
thing.
that out. Restart. Stop laughing. I'm restarting. As always, we would like to mention that we do have a Patreon. We are putting money towards supporting the Palestinians as well as the trans individuals in this country who are both facing genocide right now. We would like to remind everyone that we are in support of Palestine and we also support our trans individuals in this country. So, if you could give to our Patreon, that would be awesome. That's not directly benefiting us, that's directly benefiting those causes. And we love you so much, and we hope you have a great week.
I want to concur with Naomi. There's a lot of love, there's a lot of support in our hearts, but there's one thing we will never love and never support, and that is Aquagen Taiwanese style pineapple mango flavor collagen water made with ground up fish bones and creamy water. It's terrible. It's disgusting. As much as I recommend you find yourself a copy of Intimate Matters, I don't recommend drinking this or even looking at it funny on a store shelf. Get yourself some better sodas, America. Wake up. Don't settle for this horrendous substance.
And with that, we hope you have a great week.